Today's daf is daf Nun Ches, and we'll start on daf Nun Zayin Amid Beis, about 15 lines up from the bottom. The first word in the line is Isaron, and you move your finger to the end of the line, Torah Rabbanan. So we learned in a brisa, Minayim lemale mipsar chatos. Okay, so now the brisa is going to list a whole bunch of cases where the hakrova was done as far as Haktorah al Gabi Eish, and then the rest of the carbon, the remainder of the carbon, there's a separate lav that you're not allowed to bring it on the Mizbeach. So you've already brought on the Mizbeach for Haktorah purposes that which have to be maktir on the Mizbeach, and the rest, for example, Mala Mipsar Chatos, after the Imurim of the chatos are burnt on the mizbeach, then the basar is eaten by the kohanim. And instead, he went ahead and he took the basar and he brought it onto the mizbeach. There's going to be a machlokas rishonim here whether you violate the lav only if you burn the meat of the korban chatas on the mizbeach, or even if you just bring it up to the mizbeach. But in any event, we have now basar asham. And once again, the avarim that have to be brought and burnt on the mizbeach were burnt, and now he has the basa which has to be eaten by the kohanim, and he burns it on the mizbeach, or he brings it onto the mizbeach. B'sar koche kochim. Now koche kochim. What's koche kochim here? It seems to be an empty set. You've already mentioned chatos and asham, and it can't be ola because ola is completely burnt on the mizbeach. So there's nothing that would be subject to the lav of lo saktiru. So the answer here is that koche kochim is, as Rashi points out, is a reference to the kivsei atzeres that are brought on Chag HaShavuos, and that's called a shlomim, which has the status of koche kochim. Then we have kochim kalim, and there again, the meat of the koche kalim after the emurim are brought on the mizbeach on the eish are mutter for even non-kohanim. And then we have mosar ha'omer. Now the omer is a korban mincha, and therefore after the kmitza, the shirayim are eaten by the kohanim, and he brought the shirayim onto the mizbeach. Umi mosar shtel lechem. Now this is very challenging because the shtel lechem, which is brought together with the kivsei atzeres on Chag HaShavuos, has no haktorah whatsoever. Everything else on this list, you're maktir what you have to be maktir, and then the rest are subject to a lav of lo saktiru. You're not allowed to bring it on the mizbeach. But in the case of shtel lechem, there's nothing that is actually brought on the mizbeach. The shtel lechem are eaten by the kohanim. But the answer is, and that's why the brisa adds the word mosar, is that the shtel lechem are brought together with the kivsei atzeres, and the haktorah of the emurim of the kivsei atzeres is matir the shtel lechem for the kohanim. So once the avoda of the shnei kvasim has been completed, and the haktorah was done, was achieved, then we have what's called the mosar shtel lechem. That's the part of the shtel lechem, which is the two lechamim that are mutter for the kohanim, and he brought it up on the eish. And then we have umi lechem aponim, right? The lechem aponim are taken off the shulchan on Shabbos after being on the shulchan for a week, and the matir of the lechem aponim, to allow the kohanim to eat for the lechem aponim, is the shnei bazichim, right? Those spoonfuls of frankincense and of that. And now he took the lechem aponim and he brought it up on the mizbeach. Umishari shiari menachos means every mincha has shirayim after the komets, and those shirayim are eaten by the kohanim. And he brought the shirayim on top of the mizbeach. Shehu below taseh. How do we know in all these cases listed in the brisa he violates a lo taseh by bringing it on the mizbeach? Talmud Lomar from the pasuk he calls sior v'chol dvash lo saktiru mimenu ishe lashem. Kol shu mimenu leishim hareu b'bal taktiru. Now let's interpret this Gemara, meaning the culmination of this brisa that we just read, according to the Ravid. And this Ravid is at the beginning of Hilchas Isurei Mizbeach, and he basically interprets, and Rashi seems to also agree, that you take this pasuk and you split it in half. There's a Reisha, L'chud, and then there's a Seifa, L'chud. Two separate parts. What do I mean by that? Let's try the Seifa. If we isolate the last words in this pasuk, lo saktiru mimenu ishe lashem, that's a lav unto itself. When you brought onto the Mizbeach any of these remnants or remainders after you were maktir, what you had to be maktir on the Eish. The first part of the pasuk, on the other hand, is a separate lav, and that applies to sior v'dvash, meaning if you bring any leavened bread that's not matzah on the mizbeach or dvash, and again here there's a gigantic machlokes exactly what dvash is. It has nothing to do with dvash dvorim, what we call honey today, that comes from bees. But basically, in a literal sense, in the biblical context, dvash means when you take tamarim, which are dates, and you extract, let's say you crush the dates, that's called dvash. But even though that's the literal interpretation of the word dvash, really in this context, dvash means any of this the sweet fruits. If you take any of the masike haperos and you put them on the mizbeach, then you violate a lav. So according to the Ravid, and here we're going to see how he attacks the Rambam, you violate the lav of sior and dvash separately, and you violate lo saktiru mimenu ishe lashem separately. The Ravid, accuses the Rambam of holding that you only violate sior and dvash if you bring it together with a karman. And that's where the Ravid accuses the Rambam of making a big mistake. And he thinks that the Rambam was influenced by the fact that the Brisa quotes the entire pasuk as if it were one whole, and then you're only violating sior and dvash if and when you are maktir ishe lashem, meaning a karban, together with the dvash and the sa'ar. So then, according to the Ravid's accusation of the Rambam would come out to be saying that for being maktir sior and dvash alone, or for being maktir any of these that are listed in the Brisa alone, you would not violate the lav. And that's a big mistake. So says the Ravid. For the record, we'll mention that the Kesef Mishnah says that this was a libel, this was a false accusation of the Rambam, and if you read the Rambam carefully, the Rambam would certainly agree that if you bring sior or dvash onto the mizbeach, even without a korban, you get malchus, you violate this lav. And the Rambam would certainly agree that if you bring any of those on the mizbeach that are listed here in the Brisa, you violate lo saktiru mimenu ishe Hashem and you get malchus. The only thing is that when the Rambam says that the Sa'ar Dvash was accompanied by a karban, that's in a case where he brought the Dvash and the Si'ar on the Mizbeach, but not as a karban. but rather what the Rambam calls l'shem eitzim. So if it was done l'shem eitzim, then he only violates the lav if he accompanied the sior and the dvash with the carbon. In any event, we now have on this whole list all the cases in which you violate the lav of lo saktiru mimenu ishe lashem. Now the Gemara asks the following question: lechem v'lechem aponim yesh mehem leishim? Why does the brisa include shtei lechem and lechem aponim? These are not brought on the mizbeach. There's no part of this carbon that's brought on the mizbeach. So why are they included in the lav? And we learned in a brisa, Yotzu shtei lechem v'lechem aponim she'ein mehem leishim, that in the cases of shtei lechem and lechem aponim, if you brought them onto the mizbech, you don't violate the lav of lo saktiru menu ishe Hashem. So what do we do with this stira? And how do we justify the first brisa that we learned? Rav Sheshes ein mi gufo leishim. What we're saying here is that the shtei lechem and the lechem aponim are not brought on the mizbeach. No part of them are brought on the mizbeach. Amy gufan leishim. And that discussion about Amy gufan leishim in the second brisa has to do with the din of hagasha, which is a sugya we'll learn later on. And there's no din of hagasha with regard to the shtei lechem and the lechem aponim. They're excluded from hagasha because hagasha only applies when it's gufan leishim, when this has to be brought on the mizbech. The shtei lechem and the lechem aponim are not brought on the mizbech, therefore there's no hagasha. However, as far as the lav of lo saktiru mimenu ishe lashem is concerned, that lav applies even if there's not gufo leishim, but rather it's connected to something that has to be brought on the mizbeach. For example, in the case of the lechem haponim, it's the shnei bezichim have to be brought on the mizbeach and burnt on the altar. In the case of shtei lechem, it's the kivsei atzeres. The shnei kvasim have to be brought on the mizbeach, and we do a haktorah on the murim. And therefore, even though it's ein begufa ishim, but nevertheless it's considered linked up to a carbon, and therefore we can apply the principle and the violation of the law lo saktiru menu ishel Hashem. Itmar hamala mikulam al gabi akevish. What's the din if in all these cases that were listed in our brisa, the first brisa that we just brought, he brings it up the kevesh, but he never actually reaches the mizbeach? Is the kevesh, the ramp that leads to the mizbeach, considered part of the mizbeach or not? And that's going to be machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yochanan Omar Chayav. According to Rabbi Yochanan, the Torah is going to include the kevesh in the lav of lo saktiru mimenu ishel Hashem, and Rabbi Eliezer Omar Potter. Rabbi Eliezer says no, the kevesh is not included in the mizbeach of lo saktiru mimenu in the lav. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, if he brought it up on the kevesh, let's say, for example, shiari mincha, or whatever it might be, then he would not be in violation of the law. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayav, this Sanya, he based himself on a brisa. The brisa says, ha-mizbeach, ein li ela mizbeach. Now, this pasuk ha-mizbeach appears at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, and it says, ve'ela mizbeach lo ya'alu l'reach nichoach. And it's referring to the Shiorei Mincha. And at this point, we would say that the violation of the lav of Lo Yalu would be limited to the Mizbech itself. Kevesh Minayin, Talmud Loma Lo Yalu. Now, here's a girsa that says L'Ratzon, or another girsa says L'Reach Nichoach. And that pasuk is superfluous, and therefore, since it's written exactly after this pasuk of El Mizbech Lo Yalu L'Reach Nichoach, it's telling you that even the kevesh, according to Rabbi Yochanan's understanding in this brisa, is included in the Isser of Lo Saktir Menu Ishel Hashem, meaning the kevesh is an extension and part of the Mizbeach. Rabbi Lazar Amapotu my timer the Omar Kra Siar Udvash. Right, there are parts of the pasuk here that aren't printed in the text of our printed Gemara, but it says. Korban Rashis Takrivo Samasham Mizbech Yal Rechni Choach, and then afterwards it says Sior Udvash Korban Reish. Oh, before it says Sior Udvash Korban Rashis Takrivo Sam. So it would seem that the Torah here is Kikol Sior V'Chol Dvash is making some sort of an equation between Sior and Vash and the Isur that appears in the Torah afterwards. And what is that telling me? So it says in the pasuk, Korban Rashis Takrivu Osam. The word Osam is a ribui. I'm sorry, after ribui is a miut. Osam, meaning in these two cases, hu de Rabbi Loch Kevesh Kimizbeach. The Torah says that with regard to Shtei Lechem and Bikurim, in those two cases, the Kevesh is considered like the Mizbeach. And therefore, you would, according to Rabbi Elazar, you would be violating Lo Saktir Menu Ishei Lashem with the Shtei Lechem and the Bikurim, even on the Kevesh. Avol Midi Achrini, but as far as all the other cases that are listed in the Brisa for which you violate the Isser of Lo Saktir Menu Ishei Hashem, they don't have this extension of the Kevesh, because the Torah adds the word Osam to exclude them from the Kevesh. And now we begin today's daf, which is on Nun Ches. For Rabbi Yochanan, Hai Osamai Ovidle, what does Rabbi Yochanan derive from the extra pasuk Osam, which is a miut, and yet Rabbi Yochanan is not going to use it to exclude all those cases that we have in the Brisa from Kevesh, because all those violations apply even to the Kevesh. And the Gemara says, so now we're going to learn a Brisa about the possibility of a Nidava, which is called Motzis Vasecha Tishmar, on Shtei Lechem. Yachol, says the Brisa, hey Yachid Misnadav Mevi Kiyotzi Bo Nidava. Could it possibly be that any individual could take upon himself a neder, a voluntary pledge to bring Shtei Lechem, V'korei ani, and therefore I would apply the principle of Motziv V'secha Tishma V'yasi, so that if you don't bring this nidava of Shtei Lechem on the Mizbech, you violate your neder. Talmud Lomar, Korban Rashis Takrivu. Now look at the word takrivu, and the word takrivu is in the plural. Tzibur amarti l'cha v'lo yachid. Okay, fine. So now we have from the word takrivu a miut that excludes the possibility of an adava of Shtei Lechem on the part of a yachid, because takrivu refers to the tzibur. Yachol, I might think, okay, lo yeh yachid mevi, sheda mevi chavasa kiyotzi b'aval yeh tzibur mevi, shmevi chavaso kayotzi bazeh. Shtei Lechem is a korban tzibur. No individual brings the Shtei Lechem. It's brought on behalf of the entire Klal Yisrael, together with the Shnei Kvasim, as we said on Chag HaShavuos. And therefore could be that when the Torah says takrivu to be mamayit a yachid, that's only as far as a yachid, because the whole entity of Shtei Lechem doesn't exist as far as the yachid is concerned. But in the case of a tzibur, again, you have to figure out exactly how the tzibur took an adava to bring Shtei Lechem. So he says, in the name of Rashi here, that there was a matzah shekel that was collected, and it was put into the shofros. Right, the shofros is a kind of a receptacle where the coins were collected and placed into that container, and from that collection of the Trumas Halishka, we brought all the korbanos tzibur, like the tamid, the musafim, and the shtei lechem. And if let's say that the gizbar of the Trumas Halishka, who represents the entire Klal Yisrael, will go ahead and purchase shtei lechem as a voluntary shtei lechem, would it be valid? And now the tzibur, just like the chayev as a korban chova of the tzibur of shtei lechem on Shavuos, then anytime during the year, if they take the money from the Trumas Halishka as a voluntary shtei lechem, they'd have to bring it on the mizbech. Tamid lomar osam. And here's where Rabbi Yochanan, relying on this brisa, has a justification for the miud of osam. So he doesn't use it the way Rabbi Elazar used it to exclude kevesh from the lav of lo saktiru, because according to Rabbi Yochanan, even the kevesh is included in the lav of lo saktiru, but he uses the word osam to exclude the possibility of the tzibur bringing shtei lechem as a korban nidav. Uma yesh lecha lahavi. Now the Brisa says that are there situations in which you bring si'ar or dvash on the mizbeach? And the answer is yes. Shtei lechem min ha'sa'ar ubikur min ha'dvash. Now let's point out something. What does it mean when it says ma yesh lecha lahavi? Lahavi sounds like he's bringing it as a korban with a chova, and it's going on the mizbeach, but the shtei lechem doesn't go on the mizbeach. And the bikurim, although the bikurim have what's called hanochal gabi mizbeach, that's a sugya masech the makis, but bikurim do not require hakrava. There's no haktara burning of bikurim on the mizbeach. But the answer is that you have the kvasim that are matir the shtei lechem, and in the case of bikurim, the Torah says that you bring bikurim in advash. What does that mean? You bring bikurim in advash. You bring bikurim from the shivas haminim, and amongst the shivas haminim you have zaysim, te'enim, and so forth and so on. And now, if you take the sweet liquids out of these fruits, then if that's called bikurim, and you bring it on the mizbeach, the first of those fruits. Ushtei lechem lo yakrivu nidova. We just finished saying that according to the brisa, there's no such thing as a voluntary shtei lechem. But what about a brisa? The brisa says im nemar kol sior lo nemar kol dvash. Watch this. The Torah adds two words in the pasuk. It says kol sior and it says kol dvash. And we don't need the kol twice. It could have just said kol sior udvash. And then the kol would be ola on both sior and dvash. Im nomar. Im nemar kol sior, lo nemar kol dvash. Im nemar kol dvash, lo nemar kol sior. Why do I need the double kol? So each one has something that the other one doesn't have. And the Bryce explains. Si'ar hutar michlolo b'migdash. We have a case where you could bring si'ar in the migdash. And the Gemara is going to explain that right away. Dvash lo hutar michlolo b'migdash. On the other hand, dvash hutar b'shiorei menachos. And si'ar lo hutar b'shiorei menachos. It's all ambiguous. So the Bryce explains. Ha mipnei sheyesh b'sa'or ma she'en b'dvash, sheyesh b'dvash ma she'en b'sa'or. Hutzach lomar kol si'or, hutzach lomar kol dvash. Fine. So what does this mean? What is the unique dimension of CR, that it's Huta Mechlolo, that doesn't apply to Dvash, and what is the unique din of Dvash? CR Huta Mechlolo b'migdash Ma'nihu, Lav Shtel Lechem de Karvan Adava. We just finished saying in the Brisa that there's no such thing as Shtel Lechem that's bought bin Adava, even the Tzibur can't bring it bin Adava. And yet this brisa seems to assume that huta mechlalo, that when can you have CR in the mikdash? It's shtei lechem, and now it's going to go on the mizbeach because the tzibur accepted upon themselves a carbon dove of shtei lechem. Amar of Amram loli karv imahem. It doesn't mean that the Shtei lechem themselves can be brought on the mizbeach, i.e., through a nedava, but rather what it means is that the shtei lechem does have the possibility of going on the mizbeach. What does that mean? Obviously, that's wrong. You can't bring the shtei lechem on the mizbeach. It's never brought on the mizbeach, but it's brought with the kivsei atzeres on Chag HaShavuos, and the Kivtzei Atzeres are brought on the Mizbeach, and it's as if the Shtei Lechem are brought on the Mizbeach because we view the Shtei Lechem as being totally dependent and integrated as one entity with the Shnei Kvasim. Why do you say that this is a unique application? After all, the Bikurim, like the Shtei Lechem, are accompanied with a carbon. How do I know this? The Snan, a Mishnah in Bikurim, Hagozalos Sha'al Gabi Hasalim, right? The Mishnah in Bikurim describes the great pomp and ceremony of bringing Bikurim, and it says that there was salim, right? That there were baskets in which they put the new fruits, and the gozlos, the birds, would settle upon these baskets. I don't know if that was miraculous or if that was in nature. And hayu olos, they brought these birds as a carbon olav asalim shabiyadim nos nitanim lagon. And then the first fruits that are brought in the baskets after they brought the olos from the birds were given to the kohanim. So we see again that Bikurim, like the case of Shtei, we said that Shtei Lechem is something that could go on the Mizbeach and Huta Mechlolo, insofar as it's connected to the Kvasim. We're going to say the same thing with regard to the Bikurim, because the Bikurim are brought with the Olos, these birds, and the birds are brought on the Mizbeach. So the Gemara says, Hanulater Bikurim Hudiyasu. No. These birds are brought on the Mizbeach as Olos, not as part and parcel of the Bikurim. They're voluntary additions. La'ater means to beautify the Bikurim, but it's not like the Kvasim with regard to the Shtei Lechem. The Kvasim of the Shtei Lechem is the matir of the Shtei Lechem. It's one carbon. Now Rashi has a kasha here. Just for a second. I'm just trying to find the Rashi here. Yeah, Rashi says that the Bikurim are actually accompanied by Karbonos Shlomim. Forget about the Olos and the birds. But Rashi answers that that's not a connection really between the Bikurim and the Shlomim, because he quotes the Yerushalmi that seems to assume that the Shlomim are the carbon of Simcha, and when he brings the Bikurim, he has to bring them b'Simcha, so therefore he brings Shlomim. But the Shlomim and the Bikurim are separate. Boy, Rami Bar Chama Merav Chizda Hamala Mipsar Chatos Ha'of Al Gabi Mizbeach Mahu. Now, Chatos Ha'of is not burnt on the Mizbeach. The only thing that goes on the Mizbeach from the Chatos Ha'of is the dam. But the dam is not burnt on the pyre of the Mizbeach. The dam is just the Zrikas Adam. And the entire oaf, in the case of Chatos Ha'of, is given to the Kohen. So what's the suffix of Rami Bar Chama? How do we interpret this Isur of bringing that which has to be eaten by the Kohen onto the Mizbeach, that lav? Do we say kol shemimenu leishim omer achmona v'hai ein mimenu leishim? Is it only referring to that which has some part of the carbon is burnt on the mizbeach, like in all the cases that we listed? But in the case of olas ha'of, there's no of chatas ha'of. Okay. So we'll pick it up soon. We'll take a little break. Sorry, we have a siren here.